All right, so are you ready to dive into a real mystery?
Always.
Today, we're tackling the D.B. Cooper case. It's got everything. A hijacking, a ransom, a midair escape.
It's a classic for a reason.
Absolutely. And we've got a mountain of sources to dig through. Articles, FBI files, even
No.
some new theories.
Sounds like a challenge.
Oh, it is. But what we want to do is sift through it all, see which theories hold up, and maybe, just maybe, get a little closer to figuring out who D.B. Cooper really was and what happened that night.
You know, it's amazing how this case, even after 50 years, still has this grip on people.
It really does.
And the fact that we're still asking the same questions, who was he? Did he survive? What was he after? It just adds to the mystique.
No doubt about it. So let's set the stage. November 24th, 1971, Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, a Boeing 727, an ordinary flight, right?
Seemingly, yes.
Until this guy, calling himself D.B. Cooper, passes a note to the flight attendant.
That note, just a simple message. I have a bomb in my briefcase, but the way he did it,
Yeah, I get what you mean.
the calmness, the precision, it wasn't a frantic, desperate act. He was so deliberate, almost methodical.
You're right. It wasn't just the note. It was his whole demeanor. And then, to drive the point home, he shows her what looks like a bomb. A black metal box, wires, red lights. Talk about psychological pressure.
Absolutely.
But here's the thing. Even with the bomb threat, his demands weren't over the top.
Yeah, you're right. $200,000, 4 parachutes.
He didn't ask for millions or a fleet of getaway cars. It was almost practical.
You hit the nail on the head. And that practicality is what fuels a lot of the theories we're going to look at. This guy had a plan. He chose that specific plane, that route. He even asked for a military-grade parachute, not the kind you'd usually find on a passenger plane.
Now, when I first heard about the 4 parachutes, I thought, oh, he must have had accomplices, to throw off the FBI.
That's a common thought.
But then I started to think maybe it was more about control. Maybe he wanted options. Maybe he wasn't even sure he'd need all 4. But he wanted the choice. What do you think?
You know, that's a really sharp observation, and honestly, we just don't know for sure. That's the thing with this case. We have pieces of the puzzle, but the full picture, it might always be out of reach.
True. And that makes it all the more intriguing. But let's get back to his plan. The ransom delivery, the flight towards Mexico. Cooper was calling the shots, avoiding populated areas. He knew what he was doing.
No question about it.
This wasn't some desperate last-ditch effort. This was calculated. He was buying himself time, making it harder to be tracked. And then, of course, comes the jump. 10,000 feet, darkness, rain, wind. Just picturing it.
It's hard to even imagine.
You'd have to be unbelievably cool under pressure to even consider that.
Absolutely. And the physical challenges, 10,000 feet is a long way down. Even with a parachute, you're talking strong winds, possible turbulence, landing in a completely unfamiliar, densely wooded area in the middle of the night.
Don't forget the terrain. He jumped over the Lewis River Valley. That area is rugged, heavily wooded, and at that time of year, it would have been freezing. It makes you wonder if he ever stood a chance.
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Did he survive? And if he did, how? I mean, we're talking about a jump with everything stacked against him. It would take incredible skill and a whole lot of luck.
And that takes us right to the heart of it all, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The survival theories versus the ones that say he didn't make it that night. Let's start with survival. What are the arguments for that?
Well, the most obvious one is that they never found his body.
Right.
The FBI searched and searched. It was one of their biggest investigations ever at the time, but no sign of Cooper or his parachute. And in a case like this, absence of evidence, well, it really fuels speculation.
I could see that. It's like this little nagging doubt that maybe he pulled it off. But considering everything, the conditions, the equipment, even if he was a great skydiver, it seems pretty impossible.
It does, doesn't it? And that's where people who believe he survived point his demand for a specific parachute, that military-grade back parachute. He didn't ask for the regular ones the airline would have had.
Oh, I see. So they're saying he knew enough about parachutes to know that a military one would give him a better chance in that situation.
Exactly. That kind of knowledge could mean he had military experience, maybe even special forces training, which would make surviving the jump still incredibly tough, but at least a tiny bit more plausible.
Okay, I'm with you. But even if we say he survived the jump, then what? He's alone in the middle of nowhere at night? What are the chances he could have actually gotten out of there?
Pretty slim, to be honest, and that's where the survival theory gets even more out there. Some people think he must have had accomplices waiting with supplies, a car, a meeting spot.
Okay, well, that would make things easier. But wouldn't it also be riskier? I mean, more people, more chances of getting caught, more witnesses?
For sure. And that's one of the big problems with the accomplice idea. It makes the story more exciting, but it might not be the most practical way to go about it.
This is starting to sound like a movie plot. A team of super skilled guys pulling off a crazy heist. But let's step back from the survival theories for a sec. What if the jump was fatal?
It's not a nice thought, but it's a real possibility. Even when everything's perfect, parachute jumps can be dangerous. And Cooper had so many things working against him. The dark, the weather, the terrain he didn't know. Any one of those could have been the end.
You keep mentioning the terrain. He jumped over a really wooded area, right?
Yeah.
Is it possible that his body's just lost out there somewhere?
It's definitely possible. The area where he jumped is huge, rugged, heavily wooded. It wouldn't be surprising if his body ended up somewhere remote or got washed away by the river or even, scavenged by animals.
So nobody doesn't automatically mean survival. It just means we're missing a piece of the puzzle. But the lack of a body isn't the only thing that makes people think he lived right. There's also that discovery of some of the ransom money back in 1980.
Oh, yeah, that was a huge deal. A kid playing by the Columbia River found 3 bundles of those $20 bills, and they matched the serial numbers from the ransom.
Wait, they actually found some of the money. Doesn't that pretty much prove he survived? I mean, how else would it have gotten there?
Well, it makes sense to think that, but it's not quite so simple. Where they found the money is a pretty long way from where he's thought to have jumped. And the bills themselves were pretty messed up, like they'd been in the water for a long time.
So maybe the money washed downstream from where he landed.
Could be. Maybe it was in his pocket when he landed and somehow ended up in the river. Or, and this is where things get interesting, it could point to something totally different.
All right, you've got me hooked. What else could it be? Is there a theory we haven't talked about yet?
There is. It's one of the more fascinating ones, but also pretty controversial. It all comes down to the no body thing and the money being found. What if Cooper didn't survive, but someone planted the money on purpose?
Whoa, hold on. Planted it? By who? Why would they do that?
Those are the big questions, right? This theory says that someone, maybe an accomplice or someone who found his body, put the money there to throw everyone off the trail, to make it seem like he was still out there.
But why? What would be the point?
Could be a few things. Maybe they wanted to protect his identity, keep his memory alive. Or maybe they were involved in the crime somehow and wanted to take the heat off themselves.
Okay, now I'm really confused. We've got survival, we've got a fatal jump, and now we've got planted money. How are we supposed to make sense of all this?
It's a lot to wrap your head around, I know. And remember, we're just getting started. There are even more theories out there, each with its own supporters and people who disagree. But before we go too far down that road, let's take a step back and think about something really important. The man himself.
You mean D.B. Cooper. But we don't even know who he was.
That's it. That's the core of the whole mystery, isn't it? We're trying to solve a puzzle without knowing what the picture is supposed to be. We have a name, a description, but his real identity, it's still a mystery. And that's what keeps us coming back to this case year after year.
You know, you're right. It's not just the hijacking the money, the escape. It's about the man behind it all. Who was he? What made him do it? What's his story?
Exactly. Was he a thrill seeker? A brilliant criminal? A desperate man who just snapped? We can look at the evidence, argue about the theories, but in the end, without knowing who D.B. Cooper really was, we may never understand what he did.
It's almost like we're trying to answer a question without knowing what the question is. But you know what? That's part of what makes this whole thing so fascinating. It's like he vanished into thin air, became this legend, a ghost story you tell around a campfire. And he did it.
Right.
D.B. Cooper is like this symbol of daring mystery, the idea that someone maybe got away with it.
It's powerful, right? Someone slipping through the cracks, beating the system, disappearing without a trace. Like, we're fascinated by what we can't explain. That maybe there are things out there we just don't understand.
It's a modern folktale almost, isn't it?
Yeah.
Passed down through generations, changing a little each time.
Yeah.
And that's something we haven't talked about, the impact of the D.B. Cooper case. This was over 50 years ago, but people are still talking about it, writing books, making movies. There's even a beer named after him.
It shows how much mysteries grab us, doesn't it? We want answers, we want to know why, and when we can't find them, our imagination kicks in, we fill in the gaps, create our own stories, and that keeps the whole thing going.
Maybe that's the whole point. Maybe it's not about solving the crime, but about accepting that we don't know everything. Some questions just don't have clear answers, and that's okay.
It makes us think critically right, look at different sides, weigh the evidence, and come to our own conclusions. And maybe in doing that, we learn something about ourselves about how much we want things to make sense.
So let's bring it back to you, the listener. We've gone pretty deep here, explored the theories, looked at the evidence, even thought about what it all means. What are you thinking now? Which theory makes the most sense to you? What parts of this whole thing still bug you?
Imagine you were on that flight. What would you have done? Would you have been scared and scared? Curious, both. What do you think was going through Cooper's head? Was it just about the money, or was there something more to it?
And of course, the big question, do you think he survived that jump?
The D.B. Cooper case. It just won't go away. It shows us how much we love a good mystery and reminds us that sometimes the best stories are the ones that leave us with more questions than answers.
So keep digging, keep asking questions, keep diving into the unknown. There's a whole world of amazing stories out there. And who knows, maybe someday you'll be the one to crack the code, solve the unsolvable. But until then, the legend of D.B. Cooper lives on.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you enjoyed it.
And remember, as always, stay curious.